The room smells of hot wax and damp wool. Outside, thunder mutters over. A quill scratches across parchment, the sound thin but defiant, like a blade being sharpened in secret. Boots grinned against wooden floors as men shift their weight, glancing at doors that could burst open at any moment. Treason hangs in the air heavier than smoke. If the wrong ears hear the wrong words tonight, every man in this chamber could swing from a British rope. One by one they step forward, dip steel nibs into ink black as midnight, and sign their names. Each signature, a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A king is defied. An empire is challenged. And a fragile, reckless idea is given a heartbeat. Before that ink ever touched parchment, resentment had been building like pressure behind a dam. For years, the American colonies had been tethered to Britain by law, by loyalty, and by the invisible weight of empire. After the 7 years, a war drained British coffers. Parliament turned its gaze across the Atlantic. Tea, glass, each item stamped with authority from a government and ocean away. To British leaders, it was a practical solution. To colonists, it was a quiet tightening of chains. They paid for decisions they did not help make. And in taverns lit by flickering candles, a dangerous question began to whisper itself into existence. If a government ignores the will of its people, is obedience still a duty? Tension did not explode overnight. It simmered. It smoldered. It crept into everyday life. Merchants boycotted British goods. Farmers argued in town halls, thick with sweat and suspicion. Soldiers marched through colonial streets, their red coats a constant reminder of distant authority. The breaking point arrived not with a single event, but with a slow accumulation of indignities. Shots fired at Lexington and Concord were not just bullets. They were declarations without words. Blood answered policy. Resistance was the only way to prevent the war. They were declarations without words. Blood answered policy. Resistance answered rule. And once violence entered the conversation, compromise began to die. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered not as rebels eager for war, but as men desperate for resolution. Many still hoped reconciliation was possible. They were merchants, lawyers, farmers, men who understood the cost of chaos. Independence was not yet a dream. It was a risk too large to imagine. But as months passed and appeals to the crown were ignored, hesitation began to erode. War had already begun in spirit, long before anyone dared give it a name. What remained was a question of honesty. Would they admit what reality had already decided? It was a tall, sharp-eyed Virginian who carried the responsibility of giving that reality a voice. His task was not simply to argue for independence, but to explain it, to justify rebellion to a watching world and to a divided people. He worked by candlelight, writing with urgency but also with care, aware that sentences could outlive armies. Each phrase was a weapon, but also a prayer. The language had to be bold enough to break with a king. What emerged from those sleepless nights was not merely a political statement, but a philosophical gamble.
Power, it declared, does not flow downward from a throne.
It rises upward from the governed. Authority is not divine. It is conditional. And if a government betrays its purpose, the people have not only the right, but the obligation to change it. Those ideas were not entirely new. Philosophers had whispered them before, but never had they been wielded so openly against a reigning empire. Writing them was dangerous. Signing them was nearly suicidal. Every man who placed his name beneath those words offered his property, his reputation, and his life as collateral. If Britain crushed the rebellion, they would not be remembered as visionaries. They would be remembered as traitors. The debates in that chamber were fierce and deeply human. Some feared the chaos that independence might unleash. Others feared the certainty of continued submission. Unity was fragile. Doubt was constant. Yet something stronger than fear began to take root. A shared understanding that history had arrived uninvited and demanded a decision. They could retreat into safety and remain subjects. Or they could step into uncertainty and attempt to become civil. When the final draft was presented, silence settled over the room with almost physical weight. It was not the silence of agreement, but of realization. The words on that parchment would ignite war with the most powerful empire on earth. They would reshape alliances, destroy livelihoods, and scatter families across battlefields. But they would also declare with impossible boldness that freedom was not a privilege granted by rulers, but a birthright. And then came the moment that history remembers, not as loud, but as deliberate. One by one, men approached the table. The act of signing was simple, ink meeting parchment, but the meaning was immense. A bold signature was not vanity, it was clarity. It was a declaration that anonymity would not protect them, that they would stand publicly behind an idea larger than themselves. Each stroke of the pen turned philosophy into commitment. Each name transformed words into consequences. The document was adopted on July 4, 1776, but its power did not lie in the date. The power lay in its defiance of inevitability. Empires had ruled for centuries. Monarchy had seemed permanent. Yet here was a fragile assembly of colonies, declaring that authority could be challenged, that government could be reinvented. Legitimacy came not from lineage, but from consent. War did not end because of those signatures. It intensified. Fields became graveyards. Victory was neither swift nor certain. Independence was not guaranteed by words alone. It had to be fought for, defended, and endured. The Declaration changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer a dispute over taxation. It was a struggle over the meaning of freedom itself. Some dismissed the effort as naive rebellion doomed to collapse. Others recognized something unprecedented. The idea that rights are universal, not conditional, began to challenge governments everywhere.